Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we delve into the unsettling realm of the nursing profession, where the veil between life and death grows thin. Real accounts from nurses who have seen what others might dismiss. A flicker of a shadow in an empty room, a patient whispering to someone unseen, or the chilling final moments that suggest something otherworldly. Prepare yourselves for tales from the hospital's darkest corners, stories that are as haunting as they are unforgettable. Turn off the lights, settle in, and get ready to explore the eerie side of the nursing world. Let's begin. Hospitals are places of healing and hope, but they're also where life meets death, a realm where the veil between the living and the unknown grows thin. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about when I met Joanne. Joanne arrived one quiet afternoon in the labor and delivery department on the 3rd floor. She was 47 and visibly pregnant, but her demeanor was far from the usual glow of an expectant mother. Her face was drawn, her dark eyes ringed with exhaustion, as if she hadn't rested in weeks. Her expression was empty, almost lifeless. "Joanne?" I asked gently, trying to confirm her name. She didn't respond, not the first time, not the second. Only after asking for the 4th time did she mutter, almost reluctantly, "Joanne?" Something about her unsettled me right away. She refused to lie in the bed, choosing instead to sleep upright in a chair. When I glanced at her chart, her history only deepened my unease. Paranoia, depression, hallucinations. She wasn't just battling physical exhaustion. Her mind seemed tormented. Still, I had a job to do. "I'll be back to start an IV," I told her, keeping my tone calm and professional. She didn't look at me, just nodded slightly. When I returned, Joanne was slumped in her chair, her head hanging low, hair falling over her face. She was snoring softly. I gently woke her, explaining I needed her arm for the IV. Without a word, she lifted her left arm, keeping her head down as I worked, and then she spoke. "The hospital," she whispered, her voice raspy but deliberate, "is a gateway for life and death. Below us, the ICU, where people die. Here, on this floor, new life begins." A chill ran down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her words lingered in the sterile air, heavy and foreboding. As I finished the IV, she lifted her head and locked eyes with me for the first time. "If it's between me and my baby," she asked, her voice sharp and eerily calm, "who would you save?" Her question caught me off guard. I stammered, "Why would you ask that?" She leaned forward, her eyes darkening as her tone turned venomous. "Listen, you bee," she hissed. "Between me and my baby, who would you save?" Her sudden shift was unnerving. I tried to de-escalate the situation, telling her I couldn't answer such a question. But she wouldn't let it go. "You must choose," she demanded, her voice rising, echoing in the small room. "The decision is yours, today. Say it. Who will live and who will die?" I could feel my hands trembling. Without thinking, I blurted out, "I'd save the baby." Joanne leaned back, a twisted grin spreading across her face. Pointing to herself, she said with chilling finality, "Since you chose the baby, then this woman will die." I left the room, shaken, and immediately reported the incident to my supervisor. He went in to speak with her, but when he came out, he just shook his head. "Joanne's not well," he said quietly. That evening the doctor arrived and Joanne was taken to the delivery room. Against all odds, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But her ordeal wasn't over. Shortly after, she began hemorrhaging uncontrollably. They rushed her into surgery, but her condition only worsened. She was transferred to the ICU, directly below our floor. Joanne didn't survive the night. The autopsy found no drugs in her system. By all accounts, she was physically healthy, apart from her mental health struggles. but her last words haunted me. Since you chose the baby, this woman will die. Who was she talking about? Herself, or someone else entirely? As nurses, we often dismiss patients' claims of being pursued by something unseen as symptoms of their mental illness. But with Joanne, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, something darker, something I couldn't explain. Hospitals are a gateway, she said, between life and death. And on that night, I wondered if Joanne had crossed through it, but not alone. There's something unsettling about old buildings, especially those that have housed suffering and death. I've worked at a nursing facility for 13 years, but this place isn't just a home for the sick and elderly. Before it became what it is today, it was a tuberculosis ward, a place where countless lives ended in gasping breaths. After that, it served as a children's hospital. Now, it's a strange blend of past and present, where the echoes of those lives seem to linger, refusing to fade. Late at night, when most of the lights are dimmed, many staff members, and even patients, report hearing the faint sound of children laughing, their soft footsteps running down the hallways. At first you might dismiss it as creaking floors or an overactive imagination, but those who've worked here long enough know better. Here's the eerie part. Every year between December and January, the laughter stops. No footsteps, no giggles, just silence. And when the children go quiet, we know what's coming. Death seems to creep through the halls during those months, taking patients one by one. It's always 3. Always. One January, a man was admitted for physical therapy after knee surgery. He seemed fine, apart from being a little irritable about his pain. He was placed in room 7, a room known among staff for being strange. On his first night, he called out to us, complaining that a tall, thin girl with long, sharp fingernails was pinching him. The description sent a shiver down my spine. No one like that existed in the building. He insisted on keeping all the lights on, his room light, the hallway light, even the bathroom light. But still, he claimed she was there, standing in the corner, watching him. We didn't have the heart to tell him room 7 had a reputation. Other patients who stayed there often spoke of the tall girl, too. Some described her as shadowy and featureless. Others said her long fingers were what stood out the most. Whatever she was, her presence unnerved everyone who stayed in that room. By the 3rd night, his pleas became desperate. He begged us to move him, swearing that she was pinching him harder, leaving bruises. But the facility was at capacity. There was nowhere else for him to go. On the 4th night, everything was unnervingly quiet. No calls for help, no complaints, just silence. At midnight, one of the CNAs went to check on him. Moments later, I heard her scream. When I ran to room 7, I found him lying in bed, his eyes wide open, foam bubbling at his mouth. He was alive but barely responsive. As we rushed to stabilize him, we noticed something chilling. Large, nickel-sized bruises scattered across his body. They were fresh, as if someone, or something, had been pinching him all over. The paramedics arrived and took him to the hospital, but what they discovered later made everything worse. The man had fragments of his own skin under his fingernails, as though he'd been clawing and pinching himself. But here's the thing. None of us believed he did it to himself. The man passed away a few weeks later from complications unrelated to his stay. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whatever haunted him in room 7 didn't leave when he did. And that brings me back to the children. When their laughter stops, when the hallways grow silent, I wonder if they're hiding from something darker, something more sinister that roams these halls when the nights stretch long and the cold settles deep. Because when the children disappear, death is never far behind. In 1994, I was a home health nurse, and that year delivered an experience I'd never forget, a story that still sends shivers down my spine. It started with an ordinary assignment. My patients were often Hmong families, adjusting to American life. On this particular day, I was sent to care for an elderly woman who was paralyzed from the waist down after a stroke 2 years earlier. She had a deep wound on her lower back that required attention. Her house stood out the moment I arrived. 2 straw dolls dangled from the front door, effigies meant to ward off evil spirits. The sight made me pause. A cold breeze brushing against me, but I knocked anyway. A frail voice called out after a long silence. "Who is it?" I explained that I was the nurse here to care for her wound. The door creaked open slowly. She sat in a wheelchair, her skeletal frame barely filling the seat. Her wrists were adorned with red strings, talismans meant to protect her from malevolent forces. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying an inexplicable tension. I asked if anyone else was home. She shook her head. Her son and daughter-in-law were at work, the kids at school. She was alone. We moved to her bedroom, and as I prepared to examine her, she turned to me with piercing eyes. "Don't be afraid when I show you," she murmured. "You see, my husband followed us here after he died. In Southeast Asia, he passed and became a tiger spirit. He's trying to take me with him. That's why I've grown a tail." Her words hit me like a chill in the middle of a sweltering day. I forced a smile, trying to rationalize her statement. "A tail?" I asked cautiously. She nodded solemnly. "You'll see." As she lay on the bed and turned toward the wall, I prepared myself for what she was referring to. What I saw, however, wasn't supernatural. Her exposed tailbone protruded through her skin, a wound from prolonged sitting and lying down. The smell of decaying flesh hung in the air. I cleaned the wound, dressed it, and explained gently that what she referred to as a tail was simply her tailbone exposed from her condition. She listened, nodding, but her expression was unreadable. Then as I finished, a sound froze me in place. Heavy, deliberate footsteps thudding above us in the attic. I glanced upward, my heart hammering. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She reached for my wrist and squeezed it lightly. "That's him," she said calmly, almost matter-of-factly. "He's here, staying in the attic. Whenever I'm alone, he comes back as a tiger. You can hear him, but don't acknowledge it. Pretend you don't." The footsteps continued, moving with the weight of something much larger than a man. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, but in that moment, all logic faded. I didn't know what to say. She reassured me with eerie calm, explaining that this wasn't unusual. In every house they'd lived in, the heavy steps would return, pacing above her, waiting. I wanted to stay, but duty called me to my next patient. She urged me to go. "It's just my husband," she said, smiling faintly. "He won't hurt me." For the next 4 months, I visited her weekly. Each time I heard the same ominous sounds in the attic. She never seemed afraid, but I was always uneasy. Then one day, I learned she had passed away in her sleep. After her death, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really her condition that took her? Or did the tiger spirit finally claim what it had been waiting for? That house still haunts my memories, and the sound of heavy footsteps above me will never feel the same again. Nights in the hospital have a way of feeling heavy, like the air is filled with whispers from the past. That night was no different. I had been a nurse long enough to grow numb to death, to learn how to leave the grief at work. But every so often a patient would leave a mark. a weight that clung to you, no matter how much you tried to shake it off. Sam was one of those patients. He was only 28, but already teetering on the edge of life. Years of alcohol and drug abuse had ravaged his body, his liver, heart, and kidneys, failing him all at once. He had lost his wife, his kids, his job, everything that once anchored him. Now he lived with his father, the only person left who hadn't turned away. That night, Sam was my only patient, and I was tasked with running a slow dialysis treatment for him. He seemed calm as he lay in bed watching TV, his hollow eyes occasionally flickering toward me as we talked. He opened up about his life, about the crushing guilt that drove him to the bottle. Years ago, Sam had been a police officer. One day he'd asked his best friend to trade shifts. His friend agreed, but on that shift, his friend was killed in the line of duty. Sam had carried the weight of that decision ever since. He tried to drown it in alcohol, but the guilt only grew heavier, pulling him deeper into despair. At 11 p.m., his father arrived. Sam was already asleep, so his father and I stepped outside to talk. He shared more about Sam's downward spiral, the drinking, the refusal to get help, the pain of watching his son destroy himself. There was a sadness in his voice, a helplessness that mirrored the hopelessness in Sam's eyes. For 3 nights, I cared for Sam. We talked often, and I felt like I got to know him, not just as a patient, but as a person. A broken man, desperate for redemption. On the 3rd night, his condition took a turn for the worse. At 3 a.m., while I was performing dialysis, Sam took his last breath. We cleaned him up, prepared his body for the morgue, and then I was sent home early. But as I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the weight of his death. I told myself to let it go, to leave the sadness behind like I always did. But this time I couldn't. I pulled over near a canal, deciding to fish for a while to clear my head before going home to my sleeping wife and child. The night was still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. I cast my line into the water and waited, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Then out of nowhere, the flash of headlights broke the darkness. A police car pulled up behind me, and a young officer stepped out. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady but kind. I nodded, explaining that I was just taking a moment to myself before heading home. We chatted for a while. He introduced himself as Officer Paul and shared a little about the canal, mentioning that his grandfather had helped build it. He even joked about the type of bait I was using, telling me to try something different next time. His presence was comforting, almost too comforting. When he shook my hand and turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of gratitude. But as I glanced back to watch him go, something chilled me to my core. His car was gone. I never heard the engine start, never saw the headlights fade into the distance. One moment he was there, and the next, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Shaken, I packed up my things and drove home, the encounter replaying in my mind like a broken record. The next day, while I was on shift, Sam's father called. He asked if I could retrieve Sam's laptop from the room he had passed in. I found it in the closet and handed it over when he arrived. His eyes were red and puffy, his grief written all over his face. He thanked me for taking care of his son, and I offered my condolences. Then, almost hesitantly, I asked him about Sam's friend, the one who had died in his place. His reply sent a shiver down my spine. "Paul," he said softly. "Officer Paul." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The name, the presence, the way the officer had appeared and disappeared, It all clicked in an instant. Sam's father thanked me again and walked away, leaving me standing there, paralyzed by the realization. Had Paul come to comfort me, to watch over Sam's last hours? Or was his presence a reminder of the guilt that had haunted Sam to his grave? To this day, I don't have an answer, but every now and then I think of that night, of Officer Paul, the vanished car, and the eerie, inescapable feeling that I had brushed against something far beyond my understanding. It was 2 a.m. when I first felt it, an icy, almost suffocating presence in the room. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from a draft. No, this was something deeper, like the air had thickened around me, pressing against my chest. I couldn't place it, but something in the silence felt wrong. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital. As a nurse, I was used to the death and despair that lurked behind every corner, but nothing could have prepared me for the twisted sense of fate that would unfold in my life, leaving me haunted by guilt and an eerie connection I couldn't understand. It started with my brother, Alex. Ever since he moved in with me and our mother, things had been strained. Alex, 38, was a mess. Divorced, depressed, obese, diabetic, and plagued with high blood pressure. He refused to help out around the house or get a job, instead isolating himself in his room, playing video games and drinking beer. His unhealthy habits only made his medical conditions worse, and our life insurance premiums skyrocketed because of him. But what really bugged me was how he seemed to be throwing his life away. I worked at the hospital, and every day I saw the effects of people with his condition. The pandemic hit hard in 2020, and I couldn't help but think about Alex. The virus targeted people with underlying health issues like his: obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure. He was at risk, and I was terrified for him. I did everything I could to keep the virus away from home, constantly washing my hands, avoiding contact, and staying in my room when I wasn't at work. But no matter how careful I was, fate has a way of catching up with you. I eventually got sick. My coworkers, young, healthy nurses, had caught the virus and only experienced mild symptoms. I, on the other hand, knew I was at risk. After all, I was constantly around patients who had it. My manager told me to stay home for 2 weeks and avoid contact with my family. So I did. But one night, feverish and restless, I couldn't sleep. The cough, the headache, it was unbearable. I stumbled out of my room and noticed Alex was still up, hunched over his video game console. I grabbed 2 beer bottles from the fridge, desperate to escape my misery, and knocked on his door. He looked up and smiled, a little too drunk to realize how sick I actually was. I handed him one of the beers, and for a while, we just talked, laughing about nothing, playing video games until my body begged for rest. I couldn't stop coughing, though. It rattled through my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Eventually I left, taking some Benadryl to calm myself and heading back to my room. The next day, Alex was coughing so badly he could hardly breathe. It only took a few days before he was in the hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. Fast forward 2 years, and I was trying to move on with life, still burdened by the $180,000 life insurance payout from Alex's untimely death. The pandemic had claimed him. He was a casualty of his own choices, but that didn't make the loss any easier. It was New Year's Eve, and I was at a friend's party, trying to forget, trying to enjoy myself. The alcohol was flowing, and as midnight struck, I joined in the celebration, downing a beer to ring in the new year. By 2 a.m. the people began leaving, but I wasn't ready to go home. I felt a little buzzed, but nothing I couldn't handle. I decided to drive, thinking the roads would be empty this late at night. But as I turned onto the highway ramp, something felt off. Instead of following the road straight, my car veered into a circle, heading directly into oncoming traffic. I didn't even realize it at first. The highway was empty, except for a few cars, which swerved violently to avoid me, their high beams flashing in warning. My mind was foggy, and I didn't understand what was happening until I saw him. A blue car appeared beside me, matching my speed. The interior light flickered on, and I saw the face of a man smiling at me. Too familiar. His face was framed by the glow of the dashboard. It was Alex. His eyes locked onto mine as he sped up, only to slow down again, then speed up once more, still smiling. That's when everything snapped back into focus. It couldn't be him. He was dead. I slammed the brakes, swerving hard to the left to avoid two oncoming trucks. My car skidded up onto the train tracks, rocks flying beneath me. My heart raced as I pulled over, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew I was drunk, but what I had just experienced couldn't be a result of alcohol. The blue car, the smile, it couldn't have been real. I drove home that night, shaken, but somehow I made it without being stopped. I didn't dream that night, but when I did sleep the next night I dreamed of Alex. He came to me, his voice soft, but carrying a sense of finality. "I'm leaving for good," he told me, his words heavy with something I couldn't explain. "But I'm here to make sure you're okay." He told me to take care of myself, that I was the youngest, and my mother would need me. He reminded me of the responsibility I had, and then he was gone. I woke up crying, my chest heavy with guilt I couldn't shake. Every day since, I've been haunted by his words, by the vision of his smiling face that night. I don't know if it was a ghostly visit or just the result of too much alcohol, but the weight of his death still lingers. And every time I drive, every time I hear the sound of a car speeding past, I can't shake the feeling that Alex is still with me, watching, waiting. And no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to move on, I'll never escape the shadow of his presence.